Hey, do you maybe remember how I make stuff for other people because they're pretty cool, or I want to thank and encourage them for being awesome? Well, we're going to do that again in this episode for my awesome friend Dave, by making him a box to hold a travel flask and a notebook. I know a box might sound simple, but I was able to make it not simple by including all of these things in the process. So we'll get to the question of why I'd make something for Dave later. But for now, I knew I wanted to make a container for a travel flask that was as unique as him. So I started by limiting myself to plywood because it's symbolic to Dave's character. We'll talk about why plywood and Dave's character later. But for now, just know that I'm going to go with Baltic birch plywood because it is, in my opinion, the nicest of the plywoods. Unfortunately, it's also just about impossible to get right now because of where it's sourced and some ongoing global issues. So I've got to be careful with the material I do have. I can't be all willy-nilly with it. I don't know if all willy-nilly is just a Midwest phrase, so let me know in the comments. Regardless, you can say all willy-nilly anytime you want. I give you as much permission as I have to give. So after sketching out the idea that's been bouncing around in my head, I'm going to go with all miter cuts and bevel edges so that the plywood layers can be seen. Invisible barrel hinges because, just like Dave, they're pretty cool. And to visually break things up and for strength, there's going to be splines on every edge, and those splines are also going to be made from plywood, so that the plywood layer visual element can be broken up while also being repeated. Because sometimes design element interruption and repetition is good. Kind of like the repetition of how Dave continually treats people well, connects everyone he knows to everyone else, and is a non-stop encouragement machine. But I told you I'd tell you more about Dave later, so I'm gonna do that later. Sorry, there's just a lot of nice things I can say about Dave. Anyway, from here, I needed to figure out something called the order of operations, so I could make the right cuts at the right time in the right order. Because if I don't, it becomes more difficult or even impossible to do later steps later. So I did quick sketches of what I thought the order of the cuts would be, and I started with sketching because it's quicker and cheaper than cutting wood. But once I figured out as much as possible in sketches, I moved on to trying all those steps in wood. Because unknowns don't always become knowns all at the same time. So by moving forward, I can know more unknowns. And since I wanted to make a box out of wood for Dave, I needed to start working with wood. Nothing against drawings of boxes. Drawings just can't hold anything. Unless you crumple the paper a lot. Anyway, I practiced with scrap wood, and this montage is all the wrong ways I tried to do all the steps. But all these wrong steps slowly helped me get closer to making the final piece. And by the time I finished with the third test box, I made this box 3 times before making it for real. And while that may sound like a lot, you gotta remember that I'm not a woodworker, and I've never made a box like this before. Which isn't good or bad, I just don't expect to do anything perfect the first, second, or third time. Except sleeping. I'm pretty good at sleeping. And eating Cheez-Its.
I could do this all day.
So, I'm perfect at 2 things. Sometimes. All that testing helped me get from a cool, I wonder if this could work phase to a actual box that actually works phase. So, that's good. It's also one of the main reasons I made the splines smaller and stopped them from being seen on the inside. I hadn't seen splines used as decorative elements on the inside of a box before, and it would have worked if the overall piece was bigger. But at this size, the splines on the outside look gigantic proportionally to the box. So I quickly backed away from that, because wood splines are twitchy and scare easily. And while this man-sized Japanese pull saw looks cool and made me feel like a man, it wasn't the right size for the level of control I needed for this project. I needed to go from man-sized to something smaller, like baby-sized. A baby-sized pull saw. Although I wouldn't trust a baby with a pull saw. It's not because of their lack of motor skills. I just find babies are typically untrustworthy. Sure, they're cute, but they will lie to your face. Now remember how I told you I am not a professional woodworker? That's still true. And one of the many things I learned during this project is that there is a unique term for just about every kind of cut you can make. Bevel, chamfer, groove, dado, rabbet, miter, crosscut, rip, resaw, and probably some other terms I'm forgetting. And if you know all those words and what they mean, you can perfectly imagine what a person is describing to you. But if you don't, which perfectly describes me, then you're sometimes confused by all those fun words that seem to sometimes mean the same thing. But they don't. Like bevel, chamfer, and miter. They really do mean different things. But in the likely chance that I will mix up these words, feel free to correct me in the comments. Feedback is appreciated, and encouraging feedback is the best, especially if you want anyone to listen. So after all the testing, I was ready and had everything spelled out in my notes so I didn't have to think about anything, or at least anything important. Although I never stop thinking about bacon. Bacon. I cut down the parts and minimized how often I changed the stop block so that everything would be as exact as possible. Now, because a box has 6 faces, and on each face, which is also sometimes called a surface, I was going to do 4 miter cuts, or maybe I should call them bevel cuts. Anyway, since all those cuts are going to be glued to the other cuts, that equaled 24 contact points, also known as 24 possible problems, or opportunities depending on your corporate upbringing. Anyway, all those cuts and faces are all connected, so a small problem between 2 parts will cause bigger problems as more parts are brought into the party. And this might be one of the reasons why I couldn't find any boxes made like this by other people. Because other people are smarter. Thankfully, all those practice boxes made the real box cutting and gluing go smoothly. Did I mention the lasers yet? I don't think I did. I thought a big H on Dave's box would be cool, because his last name starts with H. So while the box glue was drying, I did the laser engraving tests on some scrap Baltic birch. That was a different thickness than what I was using for the box. I tried all kinds of speeds and power levels and took lots of notes, because I like not having to remember anything. Anything. With the box dried, it was time to put the splines in, and before doing that, I had to make the cuts for where the splines would go. All the previous testing results showed me that a table router with an attached spline jig was the best way to go. So that's the way I went. And for a few glorious minutes, I felt like I knew what I was doing. It's a nice feeling. Anyway, the splines were made with leftover scrap, and then I glued a few in, waited for them to dry before moving the box around, and then glued a few more in. Eventually, I used the baby pull saw, and it was extremely satisfying. Seriously, I highly recommend getting a baby pull saw. They're pretty fun, and the cuts you get are amazingly flush with the surrounding material. Did a few sandpaper passes to get everything smooth, and then did what I think are called bevel cuts on the router. Now every edge was showing off the plywood layers and giving the overall project a gratifying and satisfying depth of character. Kind of like Dave, but I'll talk about him later. The box got split into parts on the table saw. This is one of those steps where you have to do it right the first time, and I was glad I had practiced before. Because who wants to see a grown man crying at a table saw with a busted up wood box? Not me. The cuts were pretty good, but not perfect. So I taped 2 different grits of sandpaper to a flat board. The rougher grit got things close, then the finer grit got both parts of the box meeting perfectly. As far as sanding goes, it wasn't the worst kind of sanding I've had to do, and it didn't take too long either. Next were the holes for the barrel hinges. Like all the previous steps, I did some tests, and was glad I did because everything about barrel hinges has to be exactly perfect. And I did everything except exactly perfect for exactly a good long while. Thankfully, I had plenty of practice boxes to work on. With the process figured out, it was easy to know what to do and how to do it on the final box. I feel like I've said that a lot.
Oh yeah, thank goodness.
I wanted to do something on the inside to keep the flask and notebook from bouncing around, and realized that the only thing better than 1 box was 3 boxes. So I used some scraps to make a box for each that fit pretty snug inside the big box, while also being big enough that if Dave wanted to, he could swap out the flask or notebook for other stuff. Remember those previous laser cut tests? Well, I chose the settings that looked best, and tried out an idea for how I could get the laser to do its laser thing exactly where it needed to laser, which is exactly centered on the face of the box lid. With the paper being the same size as the box face, it was easy to line it all up, and then have the laser go through a practice run to make sure it started and stopped in the right places. The different practice pieces had different tapes, and if I had been paying enough attention, I would have noticed that the single sheets of tape would have been the way to go, instead of the blue tape, because the tiny overlaps of the blue tape strips affected the laser and caused ridges on the wood that I'd have to sand down later. But I didn't see it, and I don't know how I missed it because it wasn't like I was drinking coffee or eating Cheez-Its at the time. because you're not allowed to eat or drink around the laser. Probably because it's not safe for you, but also probably because the laser isn't allowed to eat either. And eating in front of someone that isn't eating can be kind of rude. Or maybe I went with the blue tape because of how clean the surface looked afterwards compared to the white tape. But I was going to have to sand down the surface a little anyway, so it didn't really matter. Regardless, since all the boxes were good to go, it was time to start with the finishing. The plan was to stain the outer box darker and leave the inside boxes natural, so there'd be some contrast. And just like every other step, practice pieces were made to test out all the possible different ways the finishing could go. I went with the gel stain because through researching what other people have done, the clear insight was that plywood tends to absorb most types of stains unevenly, and that causes blotchiness, except for gel stain. So I gloved up, brushed on the gel, waited a little while, and then wiped it all off before moving on to the next piece and test color. I don't know why, but I started to have a hankering for pudding. Safety alert, don't eat stains or other finishing materials, or eat pudding near any finishing materials. It doesn't show that great on camera, but even with the gel stains, the finish was still a little uneven. So the next step after everything dried was applying a couple of coats of toner to even things out some more. I don't know why the word toner makes me think of shampoo and conditioner, but it did. And I still don't know why. Once that all dried, I wanted to test out an idea of painting the letter black to push the contrast a little more, and it worked with an idea I had on how to finish the inside of the box. More on that later. So a few coats of acrylic paint got applied, and this is also when I finally noticed the lines because of the overlapping tape. After drying, I applied coats of lacquer for protection. I went with lacquer over polyurethane for a few reasons. 1, the drying time between coats is really fast. 2, you don't have to sand until the last coat. 3, it doesn't seem to affect the overall coloring. And 4, I'd never used lacquer before and wanted to give it a go. And since I never used lacquer before, I got to find out that acrylic and lacquer aren't the best of friends. If anything, they're the worst of friends. Cracking started to appear on all the test parts. Good news is I've learned pretty much everything I needed to know for this project on test parts. So doing all the finishing steps with the final box was relatively easy. Once the inside boxes were good to go, the next challenge was figuring out how to keep them in place so they wouldn't bounce around. A solution that was simple, elegant, and wouldn't degrade over time, like Velcro or straps. This isn't a pop quiz for you. The answer is magnets. I drilled holes on each side for the magnets, and I know this footage of the drilling is pre-staining, but just imagine the box being a perfectly toned darker color. Since the box is going to spend 99.99% of its life sitting on a shelf somewhere, I don't expect any of this hardware to have to work hard. It's more just to minimize jostling. Jostling. That's almost as fun as saying willy-nilly. After the magnets were placed, I did a final polish on the boxes, and then applied these really thin self-adhesive metal discs to the backs. All that time on the inside of the box made me realize that even though I had tried to make everything match up perfectly, I was working with plywood, and things weren't going to be perfect. There was some tear out and a couple of inside edges didn't match up, well, perfectly. But the solution to the problem has been around for about 3,000 years. Flocking. I know you're probably about as surprised as I was, but flocking has been around for a while. Historians on the internet trace the origins of flock back to 1000 BC in China. Back then, resin glue was applied to textile carrier material and natural fibers were strewn onto the adhesive surface, which is pretty much what I'm doing, while wearing protective gear that's linked in the video description. I don't think I've mentioned it yet, but there are a lot of ways to make a box. This is the way I did it with the tools available to me. So please, do make something however you want to, and with whatever tools and materials you have. One final polish so all the non-flock surfaces were as smooth as possible, and then the hinges got installed. These hinges had 2 spots on each side for screws, so the connections can be tight, but I just used one of each. After opening and closing the box up a bunch, additional screws just didn't seem necessary. All done. Well, not quite. The lid wasn't exactly staying closed, which is a bummer, because it should only open when Dave wants to open it. So again, magnets are the answer. I did all the measurements necessary and then put 4 magnets on the corners. I was careful to make sure the touch points lined up perfectly, and the magnets were facing the right direction for attraction to happen. Because nothing is worse than trying to make magnets attract and they end up repelling each other. It didn't take much glue because the 8mm magnets already had a great friction fit inside the 8mm holes. Thank goodness for the metric system. Although I do love all my systems equally. Anyway, the box fully opens, closes, and stays closed. Thank goodness. The flask got loaded into the box, which got loaded into the bigger box, and I loaded the notebook into the other box. Loaded is another fun word. Anyway, with everything loaded, it was time to surprise Dave. So a slight wrinkle in the plan. Well, I don't even know if I'd call it a wrinkle. Anyway, Dave and I usually meet up before Christmas. With some scheduling conflicts, we weren't able to. And at Dave's Christmas party, he gave everyone one of these. It is a really nice box with a full-size bourbon bottle, and there's also a journal notebook inside with some writing prompts. And that really good idea that Dave had a few years ago, it's a really good idea. It's a really great gift. When it comes to this project, it doesn't really change anything for me. I started this whole project as a way to give something to Dave to just show him how much I appreciate how he treats me, how he treats other people, how he uses his gifts to serve everyone. I'm still going to do that. I'm still going to give him that gift, and whether or not he uses it doesn't really matter, because the main point is I want him to know that he's appreciated. And so I'm going to go do that. So why do this for Dave? Well, the short answer is he's a connector and an encourager. And if all of us are single individual plies of wood, he is the glue that is continually connecting and bringing all kinds of people together into something different and stronger. One of the things Dave enjoys is camping with friends. Years ago, he told me one of his favorite things about those camping trips was being around the campfire at night with a group of men, as they all talked about their individual challenges. They'd finish the night by toasting and committing to be the best men they could be for their families, community, and each other. So I thought a travel flask and notebook full of all of his adventures would be nice for a guy that's been so good to so many. Because the world is always in need of good men, and I want to encourage good men doing good work that are taking full advantage of the way they've been uniquely built. Not to mention, he also hosts an annual Christmas party and challenges everyone in attendance to something for the year. One year was to take a friend out for a beer and encourage them. Dave supplied the beer money. Another time, Dave gave everyone a date night kit and recommendations on how to really listen to their significant other. One year, while we were stuck at home because of a global issue, Dave mailed everyone a spatula and the challenge to use it to serve our families. I could keep going, but one more final example is the year Dave gave everyone really nice work gloves to remind us that everyone goes through challenges. And the things we can do to survive are to receive help and give help to others. On top of all that, his Christmas party has the most amazing, best chicken chili I've ever had in my life. Literally, and I'm not exaggerating even a little bit. It's the best ever. But if you need more of an answer, just take a listen straight from Dave.
My challenge is go home and think about it, right? You got 10 or 12 days before Christmas. Think about who you want to honor. Think about what's important to you, what's important to your family. Think about what you would like your great-great-grandkids to read maybe 75 years from now about what's important that you want to leave with them. So. Yeah. Hey, Jay.
Hey!
Excellent.
Wow. So keep in mind, we've not been able to meet for a while. I wrapped that a while ago. So just keep that in mind.
Okay. I can't imagine how the date of the wrapping has much to do with anything.
It'll make sense.
Wow. That is pretty freaking fancy. Did you make this box?
I did.
Box making is not easy. Is there a trick to opening it? Oh, no,
It's gonna
got
go
a
the other,
hinge.
yeah, it's gonna go the other way.
Holy moly. Holy moly.
So you'd mentioned a while ago that you like the idea of, you know, when you go camping, you take your guys out the same way you're always challenging guys. You're built to challenge and encourage men on a large scale and make stuff. And so I wanted to encourage you and how you encourage others. So the idea is that this can go with you on your camping trip.
Oh, man.
It's got the shot glasses built into the case.
Oh, geez.
And then you had mentioned that you like the idea of challenging them something, and then you sign or they sign.
That's awesome. It's
This is meant to stay at home. This is what goes in the backpack.
That is way cool. It's almost a miniature version, in a way, of what. Yeah.
It's a miniature version of the thing you gave a bunch of guys last year.
But now this travels. This is awesome.
And so the funny thing was coming to your party and getting a really nice bourbon bottle.
Oh my God! You had this built before
Yeah, so I had to laugh.
How wild is that?
But I knew it wasn't surprising because it's like, of course, you told me about it like 4 years ago.
Okay, yeah.
And you usually do what you say you're going to do on some schedule, so it kind of made me laugh. But
that is very, very cool.
So
That is really, I will cherish that, and I'll use it.
that's the
I
goal.
will definitely use it. Yes.
So yeah, I appreciate you and
Thank you, man.
thanks for doing what you do. And
It's encouraging to me to hear you say that, so I appreciate that.
I appreciate
and it's Merry Christmas.